So officially, good morning again. The topic I was asked to speak about is 3D bioplotting, one of the many terms for extrusion bioprinting. The term bioplotting did not really make the race finally, but yeah, there are really many different terms. We will come back to that to a moment. So I will mostly speak about extrusion bioprinting. And as said before, my lab is located in the medical faculty, University Hospital of Dresden, Germany. The lecture will be divided in 3 parts. First, I will speak very briefly about some more general aspects about additive manufacturing, different 3D bioprinting technologies. Then we'll focus mostly on our work concerning development of bioinks, mostly biopolymer-based bioinks, and we'll also highlight a little bit the topic shear stress during the extrusion process. Then we will make a break for questions and discussion. And just for that part, I would also ask you to switch on your camera. That's just nice to see you when speaking with each other. Second part then will be at the beginning about strategies for extrusion bioprinting of volumetric constructs. Here I will maybe 50-50 also speak about work from other labs, a little bit about what we have done. We'll then give some examples concerning bioprinting of different cell types, so aiming in making different types of tissues, again focused on our own work. And then we'll discuss a little bit the question how far we are, and we all, the community, concerning bioprinting of really functional tissues, maybe even organs. And this I will do based on a publication from a lab from Israel, published last year about bioprinting of a human heart. Again, followed by questions and discussion. And last part will be a little bit more about some special technologies and a bit outlook. I will report a bit about oxygen sensing in bioprinted constructs, tell you a little bit about what we are doing in the field of bioprinting of non-mammalian cells, so the green bioprinting, and yeah, at the end maybe a bit special topic, bioprinting for applications in spaceflight, which is also a topic we are quite heavily involved in since now around 2 years. Yeah, so starting with a more general part, of course, you all know, some of you probably better than I do, that there are, of course, many different additive manufacturing technologies. Some, and maybe still the most important ones, are listed here in this quite old paper published from the Mühlhaupt lab from Freiburg, so the place I studied chemistry. Starting in the upper, so in the lower right, can you see the mouse moving? Okay, wonderful. So 3D powder printing. And as you know, this technology officially is called 3D printing, and therefore maybe we should really use the term additive manufacturing when we are speaking about this family of technologies. 3D powder printing, of course, mostly used for metal and ceramic powders. We have selective laser sintering for ceramics, selective laser melting, quite the same for metals. We have the stereolithography based methods, including, of course, 2-photon stereolithography, suitable for photo curable polymers. We have the very well-known fused deposition modeling, also called FFF, in which thermoplastic polymers are used, and these are commonly yeah, you also can buy quite cheap printers using this technology. And in this old paper, there is then a more or less group of technologies which were called at that time, beside others, direct printing. And this is, of course, the extrusion, but also the inkjet-based printing. Inkjet-based printing, of course, is also closely connected to the powder printing, in which you commonly print with an inkjet printhead binders to glue, to fuse the powder particles together, commonly before you then make a sintering step, but not always. But of course, common to all of these additive manufacturing technologies is, and again, this is quite known to all of you, you need a cut file describing the object you want to fabricate. You have to decide, and this is especially relevant for 3D printed implants or for other parts which are used under high mechanical loads, in which orientation you are printing the objects, which means you have to slice the virtual object, and the orientation of the layers strongly influence mechanical properties, and therefore this is a really crucial point. And with the output file you are generating with your software, this is then translated to the printer, and the manufacturing process can start. So this, of course, is the common fundament for all these technologies. Before moving now to bioprinting and to the extrusion printing technology, I want to show you this graph, which I took from the internet, which is something I think we all should keep in mind, because at least a couple of years back, when maybe there was the maximum of the hype of the additive manufacturing technologies, you could read in the media that in a couple of years everything will be made with 3D printing, and this definitely is nonsense, because it makes no sense. Looking on this graph here, this is the cost per unit versus the number of units. And here you can see that in case of the conventional manufacturing technologies, using molds, using drilling, sawing, whatever, there is a clear dependency, which means the more units of the same type of part you are producing, the lower the cost per unit gets. This is, of course, logical, because if you make a mold for whatever, a metal car, door for a car, for example, if you would make only one door, the cost, of course, would be very high, because you have to calculate the full cost of this mold for the one part only. If you use this mold for making 50,000 doors, logically, the price for one door drops. Whereas in case of additive manufacturing, this is not the case, as our printers need to print one part after the other. And so here we have a more or less linear a relationship. Clear message, if you want to make many identical parts, it would be absolutely useless to use additive manufacturing, with the only exception if you want to realize a design which you can't make with conventional methods, or only with very, very big efforts. On the other side, again, cost per unit, but now versus complexity. Again, we see a clear relationship for the conventional technologies, but here just the other way around, which means conventional manufacturing is quite cheap as long as the part you want to build is simple. Whereas the more complex your part gets, for example, you then would need different molds for different parts, for different surfaces, the price is going up. Again, this is not the case for 3D printing. For the 3D printer, it makes at the end no difference if the printer, for example, just prints a full cube or a highly porous structure. Printing of the porous structure even might be faster, as you don't need to apply so much material. Again, take-home message: additive manufacturing clearly makes sense for highly complex structures, but not for very simple ones. And this is, of course, exactly what we see in finally medicine. Concerning the number, it definitely would make sense to use 3D printing, additive manufacturing for the patient-specific implants, because here the number of units is 1. You just need for one specific patient, 1 implant. Therefore, would be useless to make molds for this single part. Here, clearly 3D printing is the optimal technology. On the other hand, the more complex our structure gets, the more 3D printing makes sense. And of course, also this is the case quite frequently when we are looking on medical applications. For which applications additive manufacturing already is used in biomedicine nowadays? As already mentioned, these are mainly the patient-specific implants, up to now, mostly made from non-degradable materials, metals, or ceramics. Few examples also using polymers like PEEK, but only very few examples for degradable materials like, for example, PCl or PCl TCP composites. Those are still not commonly used in the clinics, only in a few cases. A fast-growing type of application are models for surgical planning and education. I don't know whether one of the university hospitals in Würzburg or Erlangen already have such a 3D printing lab in the clinics. Dresden unfortunately does not have it, but just right now we are thinking about it to establish that, located at the Institute for Radiology, where these labs are commonly handled. And so this is a really fast-growing development and an application for planning of quite complex surgeries, also for multidisciplinary surgeries, for example, in the field of cancer treatments, and of course also for educational purposes. So again, to print patient-specific models just for one specific surgery. Also quite common is to use additive manufacturing, and here again mostly polymers are used for printing of tools which are used in surgery, like for example sawing or drilling guides, which is mostly necessary before then implanting patient-specific implants, because the implants perfectly have to fit to the defect site, and therefore the surgeons have to cut out, for example, the tumor, bone cancer, just as an example, exactly at that location where it was planned digitally, because otherwise the patient-specific implant just would not fit. And therefore, in combination to these patient-specific implants, now such tools are commonly also produced by additive manufacturing. We all are, of course, producing tools for our lab work, commonly, for example, for perfusion bioreactor systems, so to have sample holders really fitting to your type of construct. This already becomes very common, whereas really using bioprinting for manufacturing 3-dimensional cell culture models or 3D tissue models, this is something which is still mostly research topic. Only a few applications so far, mostly in the field of pharma industry. So there are already a small number of companies which offer such 3D printed three-dimensional tissue models for drug testing. So to avoid to test all these novel substances at a very early stage in animals, and therefore at the end to reduce the number of animals needed for these tests. Many people think that this will be a growing application, but it's slowly developing, but at least there are a few of these tissue models which really are already used by the pharmaceutical industry. What is mostly research topic only so far, as mentioned before, are biodegradable patient-specific implants. So we find hundreds, probably thousands of papers on these topics. So 3D printing of patient-specific biomaterial scaffolds, which are at the end nothing else than biodegradable implants. Unfortunately, not commonly used in the clinic so far, very few cases only. And the same, of course, what is topic of the summer school, which is three-dimensional bioprinting. As you know, again, very, very few experimental cases in which such 3D printed tissue-like constructs really have been implanted to humans in the clinic. But this will be now topic of all the following slides. So we are moving now to bioprinting. Again, what you all for sure know, nevertheless, I will just briefly touch it just to bring it up again. Of course, there are two fundamental options how you can utilize additive manufacturing when making tissue-like constructs in the lab. The first is the classical tissue engineering approach, just using 3D printing for scaffold fabrication. So you are using one of the many, and of course there are many more than shown here, additive manufacturing technologies for printing your scaffold, and this could consist of course, any type of biomaterial. So you are completely free. You also could use laser or other high energy methods which would be harmful for the cells, because the cell seeding is done in a second step only after the scaffold has been produced. And then of course you can cultivate your cell seeded structure for longer time periods to initiate something like a tissue development. In contrast, in bioprinting, the cells are integrated in the 3D printing process itself, with, of course, a number of advantages. Maybe the most striking one is that you can integrate more than one cell type in a highly defined manner, what is more or less not possible in case of the conventional cell seeding. So, of course, you can seed a scaffold with mixtures of different cell types, but it's very, very difficult, more or less not possible, to seed different cells on distinct regions of your three-dimensional structure. That is just not achievable. And yeah, this of course is the big advantage of 3D bioprinting. But if you look on the papers, if we are looking on our own work, not too many studies so far in which this really is done. So we are still at the level in which we, in most cases, only print one cell type. And I also will show you only very few examples from our own work later, in which we have started now slowly to really combine different cell types in the bioprinting process. I'm sure that you all know this schematic here from the well-known paper from Jos Malda from Utrecht, in which he showed the three, probably most important additive manufacturing technologies which are utilized for bioprinting of live cells. The first in the line here is the newest of the three technologies, the laser-induced forward transfer, mostly developed by the colleagues from Hanover. And I've seen that you will have Boris Tschishkov from Hanover as speaker later this week, and I'm sure that he will tell you everything about this lift technology. We are not using in our lab. It's not so common. You also need, of course, some a bit more advanced printers. You need for sure more experience to use it in a useful manner. Yeah, but you will have the experts later. We have then the inkjet-based technologies, also called drop-on-demand. And as you all know, this is the starting point for bioprinting. So Thomas Boland once just washed out the ink from his desktop inkjet printer and filled into the cartridge cell suspension, and then was very astonished that most of the cells survived the printing process, despite the, of course, really high shear stress you have in the print heads, but only for very short time periods, which obviously is not too harmful for the cells. Inkjet printing with single cells does not lead to three-dimensional objects because the cell is too small. You would need to print hundreds of layers on top of each other, which is practically not really feasible. You have problems of, for example, drying out because the droplets are too small, so you have only a very small amount of cell culture medium. So this is not really feasible. You can nicely use that for making highly defined two-dimensional arrays of cells, of course also of multiple cell types. You have this color type of inkjet printer you can use with different inks, therefore different cell types. But this is something more for basic research. But of course you can also utilize cell aggregates. You can use so-called organoids for inkjet-like printing, and you also can print at the end suspended cells in bioinks, just not in an continuous fashion, but in this drop-on-demand fashion. So for my feeling, these two types of printing are getting closer to each other. There are also many printers now on the market which have print heads for both types of technology. So this is not so much separated nowadays as it has been in the past. But I will not speak about this technology today, but will focus on extrusion bioprinting, for which, as I mentioned before, there are many different terms used in literature. So Jos Mulder used the term robotic dispension, which also, for my feeling, does not make the race. So this is not too often used. I think the most common term is micro extrusion bioprinting, but also bioplotting sometimes is, of course, you can find in literature. And as you for sure know, there are several technical solutions how to release your cells suspended in a suitable hydrogel. This could be pneumatic, this can be piston-based systems or also screw-based systems. So we in our lab use the pneumatic system. Yeah, and as mentioned before, in most cases in the inkjet or drop-on demand-based printers, you are using either single cells, then leading to more or less two-dimensional constructs, or cell aggregates, sometimes also organoids consisting of different cell types, whereas in the continuous printing, we always are using cells suspended in suitable hydrogels. The printer we are using are those from Gesim. Gesim is a small company located close to Dresden, very nice for us. So if something is not working, probably we just can call the colleagues, and sometimes same day in the evening, someone can drop by. Conventionally, the Gesim printers are equipped with 3 extrusion printheads, but have space for at least one printhead more. So in this case, for example, there is an inkjet printhead installed here. There are heatable cartridges so that you also can work with thermoplastic polymers. You will hear for sure a lot of that in the lecture by Carlos Motta tomorrow morning. And nowadays, GESIM also offers other printheads, like for example, one for melt electrowriting. We also have started to use in our lab, but not topic of today. I'm quite sure that all of you have seen that. Many of you will use these extrusion bioprinting processes in your own lab work. So this is a small video film taken from such an extrusion bioprinting process. Now it's time-lapse. Here we are combining two different materials. The whitish material is a self-setting calcium phosphate bone cement, and the transparent material is one of our alginate-based bioinks loaded with human mesenchymal stroma cells. You see that we can print in air, so for at least this combination of materials, we don't need any stabilizing liquid or whatever. We just can print directly in air, which is possible because the viscosity of both materials is suitable for that, even for printing of such a multi-layered structure having macropores. I hope that you could see that, and we will see more images of this type of scaffold later. So we have distinct distances between the bioink strands and the cement strands, so that really macropores are made here, and which are also kept open after cross-linking of the bioink, which is of course, at least in this case, combined with a bit of swelling of the bioink, but the pores are still open, and at least for our understanding, this is quite helpful to keep the cells alive in such volumetric structures over longer time periods. A little bit about definitions. The key, of course, for extrusion bioprinting is the so-called bioink. What is the bioink? The bioink is a combination of a fully biocompatible, of course, biopolymer or polymer solution or suspension. This should be called a sol, because a polymeric solution is not a solution like that of sodium chloride or any small molecules. This is by definition a sol, and of course live cells. Unfortunately, most of us, including myself, we are speaking of hydrogels already when we are speaking about the bioink. Of course, these bioinks have a gel-like appearance. They need to have a distinct viscosity, and so we speak about them as hydrogels. But if you look closely on the whole process, the gelation, the formation of the hydrogel, in most cases only takes place after the extrusion has been done, because only then we can really cross-link, gelate our bioink, our biopolymers, so that they solidify sufficiently so that they become stable enough for further cell culture for at least a couple of days, better a couple of weeks. In case of alginate-based bioinks, which are probably the most common bioinks worldwide, this is of course the ionic cross-linking, just by bringing the scaffold, the construct, in contact with calcium ions. There are many other options, like of course photo curing. But at least the real hydrogel commonly is formed only after the extrusion printing process. As I mentioned before, also I am using the term hydrogel because it is something gel-like, but we always should keep this in mind, that we need this additional gelation, cross-linking, whatever step after the printing process has been performed. The biggest challenge for extrusion bioprinting is that we need to find materials which on the one hand side provides us with a sufficiently good shape fidelity, and that means that viscosity of our bioinks before cross-linking needs to be high enough so that we are able to print defined, in many cases also open porous, macroporous constructs. But unfortunately, if we are cultivating cells in the lab outside of a living organism, we all know that the cells definitely don't like to be embedded in highly viscous or even stiff materials. The best environment for live cells, and again, outside of course of a living organism, is cell culture medium. And cell culture medium is water-like. And this, of course, is definitely not suitable for printing anything three-dimensional defined. And therefore, most of us are forced to work in this more or less compromise area, which means our bioinks are a bit too soft to really guarantee printing of structures with a high shape fidelity, but also our cells are not perfectly happy, to use this not really scientific term, as the matrix already is a bit stiff, or because we have to use some components which increase printability, which increase the shape fidelity, but might not be too good for the cells. But of course, we all like to end up finally in this double green area, so to combine a good shape fidelity with maximum cytocompatibility. And I will show you a little bit about our work in this field, so how we are trying to come a bit closer to this situation. What we have developed already a couple of years ago is a quite simple blend consisting of 3% alginate and 9% of methyl cellulose. And as you can see on these little photographs here, we are able to print really well-defined scaffolds. So this is, for example, a construct consisting of 50 layers, which still has well-preserved macropores, at least in Z direction. So this is a photograph from the top. A bit later, we developed another bioink. Here we decreased the amount of concentration of methyl cellulose, because we realized that this is not too nice for all cell types. But to keep the good printing properties, we replaced at least a part of that with a nanoclay material, leponite. Again, we have been able to print really well-defined three-dimensional objects like these hollow macro cylinders, and all the printing we are doing in my lab is done in air, so we don't print in any stabilizing liquids. And with this bioink, we also can print macroporous scaffolds which have open pores in X and Y direction, which of course you can't see on these photographs here. Especially for bioprinting of plant-derived cells, we will have a few information at the end of my lecture. We developed another bioink, 3% methylcellulose and also 3% agarose. This is a highly elastic material. You see this cylindrical huge ring we have printed. We can press with the fingers, and afterwards it's getting back in its original shape and size. And our newest development, here we came back to our roots, 3% alginate with 9% methylcellulose. But here we just changed the solvent. We have not dissolved these two biopolymers in phosphate buffered cell line, but in human blood plasma, and achieved quite different properties, as you will see in a moment. In all cases, as all these bioinks are alginate based, we make the cross-linking after the printing process is finished by placing the scaffolds or the construct, better to say the cell laden constructs, in 100 millimolar calcium chloride solution for commonly 10 minutes. In some rare cases, we also are using strontium. We have tested zinc ions, which of course also is working as, this is also acting as a cross-linker for alginate. So going briefly through the first type of bioink, because this is quite old work, was published online already 2014, then paper appeared in press 2017. Many labs worldwide are using alginate as bioink. Unfortunately, pure alginate does not provide a good shape fidelity. You see here on the left-hand side, this is a scaffold consisting of 4 layers only, 3% alginate, and you see that the shape of the pores already is changing, so the pores getting roundish. Also, the overall shape is not really nice. So this is definitely not a suitable material for printing macroscopic, well-defined structures. And so what we did, very simple. I really like the simple solutions. We just blended the alginate with 9% of methylcellulose, very cheap component you can buy in pharma grade. So it's a highly purified material. And with this, we have been able to print well-defined 3-dimensional structures as you have seen before. So 50 layers here, and in this top view, you can see the nicely open pores. Why this was possible? Because we are strongly changing viscosity of the bioink by adding of 9% methylcellulose, which is of course not astonishing. On the one hand side, 9% is a quite high concentration. On the other side, methylcellulose, of course, is a well-known thickener used for many also technical applications. So if you look on these two graphs here, please keep in mind the completely different scale bars. So here maximum 600, here 3000 Pascal. We have shear stress, here this straight line, and the dotted line is viscosity. So you can see there is only a very small shear thinning behavior of the pure alginate, whereas this is very pronounced in case of our blend. And of course, shear thinning, as again, I'm sure all of you know, is the key feature concerning, of course, this viscosity of the bioinks, that the material liquefies under high shear stress, which means in the moment when the material is released through the nozzle, but then again solidifies when the strand is deposited on the substrate. And this really is clearly seen here in case of the blend. Now you might think, okay, but before he showed us this schematic and told us that cells don't like to be embedded in quite stiff matrices. This is of course true. The nice thing is that the methylcellulose, of course, is not affected at all by the calcium cross-linking process, as methylcellulose don't have any chemical moieties which would interact with the calcium ions, which means the methylcellulose is kept soluble after the cross-linking process and therefore is washed out over time. What you can see here are just photographs of such a printed structure, and we stained the methylcellulose with this very basic chlorine zinc iodine solution for cellulose derivatives, dark violet color, nearly black. And you nicely can see that between day 1 and day 7, storage in cell culture medium, most of the methylcellulose is washed out, which of course leads to an softening of our scaffold. On the other side, the alginate matrix now is cross-linked, and therefore the geometry is fixed. In contrast to the pure alginate, where we don't have this enhanced viscosity and nice shear thinning properties during the printing process. This was achieved with the methocellulose, but afterwards, after the scaffold has been cross-linked, we now can release the methocellulose so that the cells again feel this soft environment which is necessary to keep them alive or happy. At the time we published this paper, we did not realize that the solubility of the methocellulose is strongly influenced by the sterilization method. This we figured out only later, but published a paper especially on that topic quite recently. So therefore, if you want to go deeper into that type of bioink, you definitely also should look up this newer paper, as depending on the sterilization method, it could happen that the methocellulose you are using is not washed out in a reasonable time span, which of course would decrease your cell viability. Looking on SEM images, and these are conventional SEM images, no cryo SEM, which of course means that we definitely have here artifacts from the drying process. Nevertheless, we are again comparing pure alginate, the two photographs on the left-hand side, and our novel blend. And in both cases, after storage in cell culture medium for 21 days. And therefore, both types of scaffolds have been treated for SEM imaging in the same manner. And therefore, all the drying artifacts should be the same. And what you clearly can see is that the pure alginate scaffolds have a completely dense and non-porous structure. So these are, of course, the macropores. Whereas after 21 days of storage in cell culture medium, we see this nice micropores in our blend, which, at least for our understanding, and also looking back to this slide here, comes, of course, from the dissolution of the methocellulose, which means where we had a bigger methocellulose aggregate, we now have a micropore. And at least for our understanding, that should help to keep the cells alive, especially if you are printing bigger strand diameters, as diffusion of oxygen and nutrients and so on should be facilitated by these micropores, which we again don't see in the pure alginate type of bioink. But this is something we need to investigate in more detail. Looking on cell viability, and here we have used human mesenchymal stroma cells, again comparing the pure alginate commonly used by many labs and our blend. Day 1 upper row, day 21 lower row, and I'm quite sure you have seen many of these live net stainings and could not see anything, because these green and red dots, at least when shown with a beamer, are looking quite similar. And for people like me, they are looking more or less identical, because my eyes have severe problems to distinguish between green and red. So I always ask my lab members to separate the channels. So here we have only the viable cells, here we have only the dead cells. And to make a long story short, we have comparable numbers of dead cells in both types of bioinks, but even a bit less dead cells after 21 days compared with the pure alginate, which might be, but this is in the moment still only theory, which might be due to the micropores helping diffusion of oxygen and so on into the strands to the cells. So how do these cell-laden scaffolds now look like? This is an MTT staining, 30-layer scaffold. Here we have used an immortalized mesenchymal stem cell line, so with H-tert immortalized, and you nicely see here this dark violet staining coming from the chemical modification of the MTT dye by viable active cells, whereas the control scaffold without cells still has this pink color just of the MTT dye. And in a more detailed micrograph, you can see here the single cells in our bioprinted strand, again, 1 day after printing. Bioprinting of mesenchymal stem cells only makes sense if you are able to differentiate the cells afterwards. This we have tested here with the adipogenic lineage, and we could show, again, always comparing the pure alginate as commonly used bioink with our novel blend. We could show on RNA level, on protein level, and also with this classical staining here that in both types of bioinks we can differentiate mesenchymal stroma cells towards adipocytes. So at least the bioink is not preventing that when we are adding the necessary differentiation factors. Nevertheless, we figured out, and you also have seen this in the live dead images before, that the high concentration of methylcellulose is not too good for all types of cells. And so we thought about how we could reduce the methylcellulose content without diminishing the printability and the shape fidelity of the constructs we are printing. And in a collaboration with Richard Orefo from Southampton University, United Kingdom, we started to work on the nano clay leponite, which again is a very cheap, commercially available nanoscopic clay material. Again, you can buy this in pharma grade quality. So this is a compound of some types of drugs and nicely can be combined with different biopolymers. Viscosity is even a bit better than this of our conventional alginate methylcellulose bioink. So here are different concentrations, and the first number here is leponite, the second is alginate, and the third is methylcellulose. And yeah, so we have tested different types of compositions. You can print pure leponite suspensions, but of course you can't stabilize them afterwards, and therefore does not make sense to use that as a bioink. We need the alginate for ionic cross-linking, but printability already is not too bad, just of pure leponite suspensions. This worked quite well. As mentioned before, here we are even able to print structures with open pores also in X and Y direction. So this is a side view here. Yeah, even a bit better than with this alginate methylcellulose. Some SEM images. Also, you see that there is not a big development over time, storage in cell culture medium. Surface becomes a little bit rougher. That's more or less all we can see. We have, of course, as always, investigated the swelling behavior, which is, at least from my understanding, a quite crucial property, especially if you want to create macroporous constructs. Because if your bioink would swell either very strongly or continuously, over time the macropores would be closed. Or another problem could be if you want to make a patient-specific type of tissue and your construct would continuously swell, then of course it would not fit anymore after some time, even might to lead to some medical problems. So you always should experimentally observe and measure the swelling, and not just for a couple of days, but really for longer time periods, to be able to judge about whether this type of bioink might be suitable or not. Of course, we have the strong swelling. When we measure, the structure directly after printing. And again, we make the printing in air, which means this is just the bio ink printed in air. Then after cross-linking, which means after having placed for 10 minutes in the calcium chloride solution and then transferred to cell culture medium. And this is just the basic normal swelling when we place a hydrogel from air in water. But then fortunately, we don't see too much swelling in the next 7 days. From day 7 to day 14, again, we have a little swelling, which is significant, but which is not developing further until day 21. So then we are more or less on the same level. And these are the light microscopical images we have taken. And you, of course, can see that we have perfectly open macropores, at least in this design we have chosen here. So the swelling is really not too pronounced. Comparison now of the cell viability, comparison with our alginate methylcellulose blend with a 3% alginate and 9% methylcellulose. The percentage of live cells, of all cells, is comparable after 21 days, even higher for our leponide-free alginate methylcellulose blend. But if you look on the cell density, which of course is a measure of cell proliferation or cell decrease of the cell number in the scaffold, we unfortunately observe, and this again was done with this immortalized human mesenchymal stem cell line, we see an quite significant decrease in case of our methylcellulose alginate blend without leponide with a 9% methylcellulose, and we see more or less constant cell number, and this is of course normalized to day 1. This is set to 100% in case of this novel bioink. So this definitely here gives better properties for survival of the mesenchymal stem cells. A very nice property of leponide is, because this is a highly charged, these are highly charged particles, that it binds especially proteins, depending of course on the charge of the protein, quite strongly. So what you can see here is released of bovine seroalbumin, upper row, and VEGF, so the vascular endothelial growth factor, lower row, from our leponide-free bioink, so our conventional 3,9 composition compared to the leponide-containing composite blend. And to make it short, you can see we have dramatically different release kinetics for both the BSA and especially for the VEGF, which is strongly bound by the leponide, so that we have really a linear release of the VEGF from the leponide containing blend. In the paper, you also can find that we have checked bioactivity of the growth factor, so we could show that the growth factor is released in a biologically active form. So this is not altered by the binding to this leponide nanoparticles. And with this, of course, now you can nicely play around also, of course, with the concentration of the leponide, and can use this type of bioink also for controlled release and functionalization of your construct with different drugs, growth factors, proteins, whatever. Very briefly about this additional bioink we have developed especially for plant cell printing. Again, we figured out here that the high concentration of methylcellulose is not too helpful for the plant-derived cells. A little bit information on that later in the last part of my presentation. And so we replaced 6% of methylcellulose with 1% of agarose. You will know that agarose has thermosensitive gelling behavior. Conventionally, if you just make a pure agarose or, for example, agar gel, you just heat up your agarose suspension until you create the agarose sol, and then by cooling down, gelation takes place. And this, of course, makes this type of bioink especially suitable for bioprinting of non-mammalian cells, because here you don't need to warm up your cultures to 30-70 degrees Celsius. You make the cultivation commonly just at room temperature, and here, of course, the agarose is a nice component, as you don't have any risk of a softening at the temperature of your incubator. Yeah, and again, very briefly, viscosity properties here. On the left-hand side, development of the viscosity over time at a constant shear rate of 10 per second. And here again, we see a nice shear thinning behavior, especially for this blend containing all three components, as mentioned before: alginate, agarose, and methylcellulose. And as you have seen on the photographs before, therefore highly suitable for bioprinting purposes. Yeah, so our newest development in the world of bioinks, again, very simple. We just changed the solvent. In this case, we came back to our classical composition, 3% alginate, 9% methylcellulose, but to boost more or less the biocompatibility, to add factors which should support cell adhesion and cell growth, we just used now human blood plasma, which we very easily could get from the blood donation service, which is just on the other side of this street where my institute is located, here in the medical faculty of Dresden. And what we used here is blood plasma pooled from 5 donors, just to get rid of donor-specific properties. But of course, if you really want to make something for the clinic, you can just use the blood plasma of the patient you want to print something for. To donate blood plasma is really not an issue. Even a person who is not 100% healthy can do that, as the blood plasma is formed quite rapidly, of course, again. And yeah, therefore this would be a nice option then for bioprinting of patient-specific constructs, also from the biological point of view, not only concerning utilization of course, autologous cells, but also autologous blood plasma. The viscosity properties are really nice. Viscosity is even higher, blue curve, of the no, sorry, we don't have the curve here. Sorry, wrong from my side. I thought we have integrated here also alginate methylcellulose without plasma, but this is not the case. So of course, pure plasma definitely not suitable for bioprinting. This is, yeah, too soft. No, not a suitable viscosity. When we are dissolving just alginate in plasma, we are getting closer to regions which could be used for bioprinting, but really suitable properties only when we add, again, our methylcellulose. Very nice shear recovery behavior, which means we are measuring the viscosity here at high shear rate and at low shear rate, and switch several times, which means we switch on and switch off the rotation of our rheometer. And you see that we have a really high viscosity at 0 shear. We get this perfect shear thinning at high shear, but this can be repeated several times, which means we have a very nice shear recovery behavior of this type of bioink, which is again, of course, helpful for extrusion bioprinting. Some images of constructs we have printed out of that. You will know that especially colleagues from the United States, they love to print the logo of their university. So we also did this now with TU Dresden logo and the logo of our institute. Again, we can print multiple layers. We have nice macropores. And of course, again, we have this microporous surface structure, as again, we have the mesocellulose as a soluble component, which is not cross-linked by the calcium ions and therefore should be and is leached out over time when we store the structure in cell culture medium, or when we, of course, cultivate our bioprinted construct furthermore. In the last couple of years, it became quite common, and if I remember correctly, also Würzburg is, of course, or has been involved in that, to not only measure viscosity, but also to do this filament fusion test. So we did this as well with different needle diameters here from 250 to 610 micrometers, and yeah, could show that this really is a suitable bioink. And yeah, you see here, we can really print with a small nozzle diameter strands very close to each other, and we don't see fusion of the strands here. Not going into details because I'm a little bit running out of time. It's nice to have 4 hours, so at the end I will not spoil your time schedule, but yeah, I think it should not take too long at the end, so I will speed up a little bit. Here again, we have measured over time the swelling behavior. So we have just measured the strand width, in this case, over 35 days, as you will see a little bit later in the second block of the lecture, that we, with this bioink, really performed cell culture for long-term experiments. Here, comparison of pure bioprinted scaffolds, and again, those you have seen in the video film before, in which we have printed the bioink in combination with the self-setting calcium phosphate bone cement. Little bit different behavior of the swelling, but not too pronounced. And we were very happy to see significantly better cytocompatibility of our now plasma-containing bioink. Lower images, again, dead and live cells separated in 2 different images. Day 1, in comparison to our conventional alginate methylcellulose blend, in which we dissolve both components just in phosphate buffer saline. And this, of course, we also quantified based on this live dead images. And this, of course, also was highly significant. At the end, it gets a bit complicated, and I will also only touch this quite recent study we published earlier this year in Biofabrication. I also have to confess that the mathematical part of this study is really above what I can follow. I'm a simple chemist, so not learned too much about mathematics in the past, and unfortunately forgot maybe around 95% in the meanwhile. But I have a very clever PhD student, Julia Emmermacher. She also is the one published first on bioprinting on plant cells. This paper published under her previous family name, Julia Seidel. And yeah, she really looked into detail in a collaboration with colleagues in Berlin, using both experiments and also mathematical modeling simulations about shear stress of extrusion bioprinting, using a real needle design. So one of the common polymer needles from company Globaco we are commonly using in our lab, and of course compare then both experimental and modeling data. She also used two different cell types. On the one hand side, this immortalized human mesenchymal stem cell line, H3 MSC, where we have quite homogeneous cells, of course, as this is just one cell type, spherical shape of the cells, and a diameter of around 40 micrometer, but also plant cell derived aggregates, which have quite different sizes from around 50 to 500 micrometers. You see the images above with a quite versatile morphology. So many of these aggregates are not spherical. And of course, the plant cells also have a quite stiff cell wall, cellulose based, in contrast to the very soft and deformable mammalian cells. In this simulation part, and yeah, as I mentioned before, behind this is really some tough mathematics. She calculated quite a number of different values: static pressure, velocity of the bioink, the shear rate, the shear stress, and also dynamic viscosity, with a special focus on the tip of the nozzle, where of course things like the shear rate should be highest logically, especially shear stress. So this here should be the most critical point for release of the cells. But what I already have mentioned before, if you think back to inkjet bioprinting, where the shear stress is of course in the printhead is significantly higher than in case of extrusion printing, at least a number of cell types should be able to withstand this shear stress. So cells obviously are not too sensitive to shear stress. One of the major results of this study was that addition of the human cells to the bioink did not affect the bioink flow, at least not significantly. So Julia just measured experimentally the material flow over longer time periods, keeping of course the pressure constant. And you see that the pure bioink, and this has been done with the bioink consisting of alginate, agarose, and methylcellulose, as shown before, has a quite similar flow behavior than the cell-loaded bioink, and this was tested with two different cell concentrations. Whereas in case of the cell aggregates, the plant-derived cells, we see effects in a concentration-dependent manner. Here we can give the concentration only as a mass, biomass per bioink weight, as in these cell aggregates we are not able to count the single cells, so we only can measure that by weight. So here these cells obviously have an effect, as they obviously change viscosity of the bioink and also at the end the flow in the nozzle. If we are looking on now cell viability, and I will focus now only on the human cells, not on the plant-derived cells, the outcome was quite astonishing for us, because what we realized is that the big drop in cell viability, so percentage of living cells, we see between the cell suspension in cell culture medium and the cells by hand, thoroughly, carefully mixed with our biopolymer components to form the bioinks. So here in this process step, we have the dramatic drop of cell viability, whereas the printing process does not affect this in a significant manner, especially not with a big nozzle diameter of 840 micrometers. Here we see no additional drop of cell viability. We see a little drop, but this is not statistically really relevant when we are extruding our bioink through the 250 micrometer needle. And yeah, but again, the big drop is here, the first step, mixing of the cells with, of course, in our case, quite viscous hydrogel blend to form the bioink. By the way, this mixing step is something we are just in the moment investigating further, also related to our work for application of bioprinting in spaceflight, because in space, no chance to mix something by hand in an open flask as we do this commonly in our lab. So we are just in the moment looking for syringe-based and so on methods to do this in a really defined manner, and also try as a side effect more or less to find solutions for combinations of cells and these hydrogel-like bioink components which are less harmful to the cells. So we have, and now I have to take care not to get confused with these different values here. So if I remember now correctly, this is the shear stress below. And we therefore have tried whether we can mimic similar amounts just in a rheometer. Because the common knowledge or the common feeling is that the shear stress really should be harmful to the cells. So we just took our cell-laden bioink, placed it in the rheometer, and applied quite similar shear stress. Then we found it here, but for different time spans. So 10 seconds, already longer than the time the cell really, or the bioink really is in the nozzle tip, which means in the region we have this high shear rate, but then also for 300 seconds, so significantly longer time periods. And here we can see some drop of cell viability, but again, this is not really statistically relevant. And also here the two values, 10 seconds, 300 seconds, this is not a dramatic additional decrease in cell viability, which means the shear stress seems not to be really the biggest issue, at least not for this human mesenchymal stem cell line we have used for the study. But this for sure is something one should now look into more details, using other types of bioinks, especially those in which maybe this viability drop is not so pronounced as in the case of our quite viscous bioink component, and of course also with other cell types. So in this study, which is really a long paper, you will find significantly more information. So I just took out maybe some of the key take-home messages. So to summarize this first part, extrusion bioprinting is a quite simple technology, as of course most of you will know, as hopefully many of you will apply this technology in your own work. And it also does not require complicated hardware, which does not mean that these bioprinters are simple instruments, but there are nowadays some quite simple instruments which are of course not as versatile. They maybe have only 1 or 2 printing channels and so on, but at least they don't kill the cells. if you use the right bioink. So no need to really have very, very complicated hardware. The key for sure are the bioinks, which should provide suitable viscosity, also printability and shear thinning properties, but of course also high biocompatibility, and this for the respective cell type you want to print. So it does not make sense just to develop one bioink and then if it's good, you have the working horse for all type of cells you want to print. You really have to check that with every cell type again, and maybe you have to change composition to really meet requirements of the distinct cell type. And this is especially relevant if you want to print cells which need to bind to the matrix, which need to bind with integrin to some binding places. If you use for those cells bioinks which does not offer such binding places, the cells, at least over longer time periods, probably will not be too happy. In contrast to cells which like to be in a roundish, more morphology, like for example cartilage cells. So you really have to look on every single cell type. As just mentioned, the critical step is the mixing of the bioink components, combination of polymers, biopolymers, and cells, whereas probably less critical is the shear stress during the extrusion process itself, at least based on our data as shown a minute before. So this was part one. So moving forward to the second part, here I want to give you some insights about strategies for extrusion bioprinting of volumetric constructs. And here I will not so much focus on our own work, but also give an overview about what has been published. We'll then give a bit more examples for bioprinting of different types of human cells. And with the help of one paper which was published last year around Easter, I want to discuss a bit the question how far we are concerning bioprinting of really functional human tissues or even human organs. By the way, all my slides have on the lower right corner a number. So if you have a question, comment to one a distinct slide, you can also mention the number, that I can go back to that. So what I will present now in this first part of the second chapter is something we published three years ago. So if you want to go deeper into details, you also have the opportunity to look this up in this publication, which is mentioned below here. So what we came up in this study was that you can group the possible solutions in 5 subtypes. One we called technical solutions, one external stabilization, one internal stabilization, and the last one, the fourth, sorry, core shell bioprinting. And I want to give some examples for all these strategies, which are, of course, investigated by many labs worldwide. So starting with the technical solutions, this includes, for example, a cooling or even a freezing process already during the printing process, and therefore overcoming the softness of the bioink, and therefore the risk of collapse if we are really moving towards bulky volumetric constructs. Then there are options of simultaneous cross-linking already during the extrusion process. This could, for example, be done in case of these alginate-based bioinks that you are spraying after extrusion of one layer. For example, calcium chloride solution on the printed layer, or that you are lowering the building platform slowly into the bath you are using for cross-linking, which again would prevent the squeezing of the scaffold just by the weight of the layers. Another quite fancy method is to print into stabilizing liquids, and this can be, for example, ultra-hydrophobic fluorocarbons or suspensions of microparticles, for example, consisting of gelatin. On this point, we will have some insights in this study I will show concerning the question how far we are about printing of functional organs. And last but not least, of course, when you are utilizing photo-curable bioinks, you can do photo polymerization already during the printing process, again to start to stabilize the structure already before the printing process really has been finished. Just one example for the printing into stabilizing liquids. This comes from Horst Fischer's lab from Aachen. So he has shown, and this also of course has been published, that he can print different types of bioinks, mostly agarose based, into such an ultra-hydrophobic fluorocarbon. These are, by the way, liquids which are also used as artificial blood, as they have very good solubility for hydrophobic molecules like oxygen. And yeah, so he showed that he can really print very soft bioinks, including cells, like such an hollow, upright standing cylinder into this liquid. And these fluorocarbons are not harmful at all to the cells. And as mentioned before, they even can be used to keep the cells alive for longer time periods if you have really long printing processes, as they show this very good solubility for oxygen. Example for freezing during printing. This is a study coming from Korea. Here they are extrusion printing on a stage which is cooled down to -10 degrees Celsius, which means the cell-laden bioink is frozen after deposition on that surface. And with this, of course, they also can print quite well preserved, bigger, higher scaffolds, thicker scaffolds. What, of course, need to be mentioned here is that the heat transfer, which means in this case, the transfer of the coldness of this plate is, of course, limited. So when you print directly on the metal sample holder, you have a perfect transfer of the heat, of the negative heat, of the coldness to the bioink. But the more layers you are printing on top of that, the less this low temperature is, of course, transferred to the next layer. So therefore, this also is a bit a limited technology. Nevertheless, very well preserved open macroporous structure here. And astonishingly, this was not harmful to the cells. So the cells survived the freezing and then thawing process after cross-linking again in a calcium chloride solution. Very common is the strategy to use an additional, significantly stiffer material for stabilization of bioprinted constructs. Already many years ago, people have started to co-print thermoplastic materials like polycaprolactone, or also this is published, highly concentrated hydrogels, not cell-loaded, just as additional mechanical support structures, and then either filling up the remaining pore volumes with the bioink, which means you then can use a really nearly liquid bioink. Problem here is, as shown in this schematic on the right side, you are ending up with non-porous constructs at the end. And if you want to do this for really printing of volumetric big structures, you might run into problems concerning oxygen and nutrient supply, as then these substances have to fuse through this bulky hydrogel, which even is interrupted by the thermoplast strands, which of course do not allow any diffusion. But you also can, of course, co-print such a mechanical support material with its sufficiently stiff bioink, so that you can keep the macropores open, or you can utilize an additional sacrificial material, which is dissolved after cross-linking, stabilization, whatever, of your cell-laden bioink. All this has been done and shown. Yeah, what we have done in this field, and this I will demonstrate a bit later, is combination of bioink not with thermoplastic polymers, but with the self-setting calcium phosphate bone cement, which of course only makes sense for bioprinting of bone-like structures. For my knowledge, the first paper in this for this strategy comes from Utrecht. It was Malda's lab, published already nearly 10 years ago from Schumann, and they just did what I've mentioned first. So they printed in an FDM-like method PCL and then filled up the remaining pores with quite soft hydrogels, but ending up with non-porous structures. And they already demonstrated at that time that they really can print macroscopic structures like this strongly simplified ear model. Couple of years later, from Atala's lab, quite similar work. Astonishingly, they have not cited the Utrecht paper in a good manner. They did the same, but a little bit more advanced, which means they used two different bioinks loaded with two different cell types, and they also used a third material, which was a sacrificial material, so that they are ending up with a truly macroporous structure at the end, for the reasons I've mentioned, oxygen supply and so on, for sure very helpful. Yeah, I will give a bit more information about our work later. Now here it's mixed up. Internal stabilization, this of course is the strategy we are mostly following, and I already have mentioned, of course, a lot about these thickeners we are adding to our bioinks, like the methacellulose, also the leponite, agarose can be seen as that, which means the aim is to increase viscosity of your bioink so that you are able to print directly without any other technical tricks or hints, volumetric and fortunately still macroporous structures. Of course, we always need to keep in mind not to alter in a negative manner the cytocompatibility by this increase of viscosity. Yeah, and how do you do that? You can either add just thickeners, gelling agents, like we do this with the methacellulose, other components, or as discussed with Aldo Boccaccini before, of course, also by adding of particles. Also nanofibers, microfibers has been used successfully for that. Of course, we have the opportunity to use the photocross linkable bioinks. I've already mentioned that before. So this approach could be seen in the group of technology-based, as you of course need the UV light source, whatever, for the cross-linking process, or you can see it here, as this is of course an unique feature also of your bioink. And last but not least, of course, it's relevant to mention that you can combine this approach with the other, as we do this, for example, external-internal. So we are using highly viscous bioinks, but are utilizing the self-setting calcium phosphate cement as an additional material for mechanical stability and stiffening. Just one example here, because this is also commercially quite relevant here. These are the bioinks commercially available by cell ink, so based again on alginate, but then increase of viscosity by the addition of nanofibrous bacterial cellulose. I am a little bit skeptical about this approach. The printing properties should be quite good. We are not using these types of bioinks, but many people do. And the company also is doing quite well, so it seems to work nicely. But of course, these pure cellulose, so at the end chemically not modified, in difference to the methylcellulose we are using, which is soluble bacterial cellulose, as any cellulose, of course, is not degradable by mammalian organisms, and that could lead over the time to a frustrating macrophage response we definitely don't want to have if we really want to implant such bioprinted tissues into patients at the end. But as a working horse for research purposes, it seems to work well. Yeah, and last but not least, core shell bioprinting. This, of course, is another opportunity quite a number of labs are working on in the meanwhile, including ours. So here you are, of course, again, combine this soft bioink with an additional stiffer material, but not in separate strands, printed next to each other, but combined within one strand in a core shell fashion. And you can do both designs. You can have the stiff component as the core and the softer bioink as the shell. For my feeling, more helpful for the overall stability is, of course, the other way around, to have the stiffer supporting material as the shell, and the which also protects then the bioink, which may be quite soft, which forms the core. What you, of course, have to keep in mind here is that you have a very intense contact between the two material, in contrast to this alternating printing where you just have the crossing points where the two different materials come into direct contact to each other. Here the bioink is either covered by the second material or the other way around, so therefore this second supportive material definitely may not be cytotoxic at all, otherwise it makes no sense. One example from literature, study coming from UK. Here they have tested a number of core materials, cell-loaded with stiffer shell materials, and this worked quite nicely. So this is a fluorescence image combined with a light micrograph. You see here the staining of the live cells in green, and you see the diameter of the whole strand. So the shell part is this here. And with this method, they have been able to print quite soft, also collagen-based bioinks, stabilized by a number of different materials, mostly alginate-based as shell material. And the overall morphology of such a macroscopic scaffold, you see the scale bar here, 1 centimeter, is not bad. So quite well-defined structure, even in this dimensions here. We also started with core shell bioprinting already quite some time ago. Unfortunately, still not published anything on this topic, but yeah, manuscript in preparation already since a longer time now. So you see here this core shell printhead. In the meanwhile, we are using such printheads made by SLA printing ourselves from photocurable polymers. And morphology of our scaffold may be even a little bit better than that of the colleagues. Very clear corners and edges. And also here this is printing of human endothelial cells, HUVEC cells. And we have used our alginate methyl cellulose blend as shell, and Martigel, so a very soft bioink, as core, which definitely cannot be printed without such a core shell morphology for external stabilization. So this is working quite well. And a little bit later, I will show you some recent work we have done where we now moved a step forward, already adding cells to both parts, so to the core and the shell part. Yeah, a little bit later. So we have started already a couple of years back to use bioprinting really for a number of partly very different types of cells. You already have seen some examples for the human mesenchymal stem cells. We have studies using pancreatic islets. We have been the first worldwide doing successfully bioprinting with live microalgae and then also plant cells. Quite right now, in the moment, we are doing bioprinting of live diatoms. And at least for our knowledge, there are 0 papers so far on this topic. So if we are fast enough, we also could be the first publishing on bioprinting of diatoms at the end, in the moment, just for fun. But you will see at the end, if there will be time for that last part, that yeah, green bioprinting also might have some useful biotechnological applications. We already have seen this video, therefore I will only show the first seconds again. So I will start with a bit of our work on bone bioprinting, and what we commonly do here is that we combine the bioink with the self-setting calcium phosphate bone cement. This is a material not developed by ourselves, but by the company Inotera, which is located close to Dresden. This is a very well-known alpha tricalcium phosphate based cement, which sets to hydroxyapatite. And yeah, the only novelty more or less is that this company has suspended the precursor powder in a fully biocompatible oily liquid so that we can use it for extrusion printing. And when it comes into contact with water, and water can be gaseous water, which means humidity, or also, of course, liquid water, this setting reaction is initiated, which means the alpha tricalcium phosphate is transformed to hydroxyapatite, and this leads to the solidification. Yeah. So we started on that already a couple of years ago. I will not show you the older work, but only the newer work we did with this plasma-based bioink. We published on quite recently. So you see in the morphology of the structure here, the bioink, of course, and the cement strands. The bioink is swelling a little bit, the cement not at all. And of course, we are free concerning morphology of the printing process, can do some completely different arrangements of the strands in the different layers, can also print such, for example, gyroid structures. Also, this is bioprinting, but the bioink is not clearly visible, but we always have here inside of this trabecule-like structures, the cell-laden bioink as well. As briefly mentioned before, we need now stabilization for both materials. We need the setting of the cement and the cross-linking of the alginate-based bioink. And the regime we finally came up with was that after printing, we are initiating a pre-setting of our cement just by placing the scaffold in humidity. Why we are doing that? If we would place the scaffold directly in the calcium chloride solution, some cracks would form on the surface of this thin calcium phosphate strand. So we need to achieve a solidification of the surface of the cement strands, and only then we could place the scaffold in an aqueous solution. We investigated in detail how long the cells survive this storage just in humidity, and found out that for up to 30 minutes, it's not a problem for cell viability at all. So 20 to 30 minutes in humidity, then 10 minutes in calcium chloride solution, and then we transfer the construct into cell culture medium and put it into the incubator, which means also that then, only then, the structure is warmed up to 37 degrees again. These are some fluorescence images showing the structure over the first 14 days. You see the high cell loading in the bioink. You have seen live dead images before in the first part. Despite the swelling of the bioink, we still have open macropores over all the time periods. We have investigated that. After 14 days, we see a bit of aggregate formation of the cells in the bioink, but we see already after starting around day 7 that cells are starting to migrate out of the bioink onto the surface of the stiff cement layers. Why this? Because osteogenically differentiated human mesenchymal stem cells, and these are the cells we are used here, of course, don't like to be embedded in soft hydrogels, but like to adhere on stiff and also like, of course, calcium phosphate-based materials. We have done cultivation up to 35 days. We were really satisfied to see, on the one hand side, that we have thick cell layers after this over 1 month of cultivation time. On the cement strands, we still have a lot of live cells, mostly clumped to this more or less aggregate-like structures in the bioink, and the overall stability of the structure still was perfect. So we still could make change of the cell culture medium without any risk of sucking the parts of the scaffold into the pipette or so. We still nicely could handle these structures, even after more than 1 month of cultivation. And as already mentioned before, at day 7, we observe migration of the first cells from the bioink onto the calcium phosphate strand surface, which of course completely has set to hydroxyapatite. Of course, we now can use this method to move forward to more complex structures. Already in a first paper here, we have used the alginate methylcellulose ink without the blood plasma. Cell data not as nice, but also acceptable. We proposed this type of structure one could utilize for osteochondral defects, which means deep defects of the articular cartilage in which the underlying bone tissue is already negatively affected too. So we proposed a non-porous hydrogel-only layer for defect filling of the chondral part of the defect, an interwoven layer we need for binding the very different materials onto each other. Otherwise, if we just would print an alginate-based hydrogel onto cement, there would be no chemical interaction. The two materials just would fall apart. And of course, we also can sell this interwoven layer as a model for the mineralized cartilage, and then the subchondral bone, in this case, consisting of the cement only. In the meanwhile, we have hard worked on that topic, and just a couple of weeks back published a first paper on just on these osteochondral bioprinting, David Kilian's PhD thesis. I think I have only this 2 slides on that topic. It's a quite big paper. As mentioned before, we have now again the non-porous but printed, of course, chondral part, then this interwoven layer, and the cement part. And we have investigated this in detail with in total 5 donors for human primary chondrocytes. We have isolated ourselves from human femoral head. We can get from the orthopedic hospital here in Dresden. And we have then really investigated in detail all the different options of how cells are printed, are bioprinted, which means we have looked on pure bioink scaffolds. We have looked on this interwoven material where we have alternated printing of bioink and the calcium phosphate cement. We have these piled structures. So we printed the 2 materials on top of each other. We have then also used just the alginate gel non-printed to avoid any possible negative effect of the bioprinting process, and also combine this pipetting by hand with our calcium phosphate cement. So to really try to figure out all the effects on the different materials and processes onto each other. Due to time reasons, I have not included slides into that lecture today, but you can find the paper shown here below if you are interested in that, in just some photographs showing these different setups we have investigated here, and you can look it up yourself. One slide on bioprinting of pancreatic islets. We also already published about last year quite nice results. Not many papers on that topic, even quite a number of labs are working on it. So Jos Malda's lab and Jacqueline Alblas already published a couple of years ago on successful bioprinting of islets. And islets, maybe not everyone knows that, are the cell aggregates in our pancreas, which are the cells producing insulin, which means controlling the blood glucose level in our body, in our blood. Therefore, extremely important cells, and just the cells which are not working properly or not working at all at the end in diabetic patients. And therefore, this is also a quite relevant topic for diabetes therapy. But in the Utrecht study, they only could show that the islets survived the bioprinting, but they were not functional anymore in the bioprinted state, which means that the islets, the beta cells, as part of the islets, did not release insulin when stimulated with high glucose concentration in the surrounding cell culture medium. We now could show that, and this is a close collaboration with our colleagues from the Medical Clinic 3 and a really very famous lady, Barbara Ludwig, who is heading also the pancreatic islet transplantation unit we have in Dresden, which is the biggest one in whole Europe, fortunately, so very nice collaboration partners. This is maybe the key graph from this paper. So these are, this is the insulin secreted from the islets, normalized to the cell mass based on DNA. These are the control islets, which means the non-printed, just the cell culture medium, and these are the bioprinted ones. And this shows here the concentration of glucose in the cell culture medium, and you nicely can see that we can stimulate insulin secretion even in these bioprinted islets, which is not simple at all, as these islets are really big. Therefore, we also had to use quite big nozzles to not damage the islets too much. This is a topic we are continuing to work with, also collaboration with Munich. We have access to some special islets from genetically modified pig. Very nice topic, but yeah, still ongoing work. I can't tell too much about it. I think the last example for different cell types, this is also quite novel work, still not published. Here we now really made the step forward to bioprinting of different cell types in a core shell fashion. So what we did here was to combine an hepatocyte cell line, G2, a very common human hepatocyte cell line, and fibroblasts, the 3T3 cell line, which have been shown in many studies to support the functionality of these hepatocytes. As of course in our liver, we also have close interaction of hepatocytes with a number of other cell types, including fibroblast-like cells. So we have printed the fibroblasts in the core with our classical alginate methylcellulose bioink, and the hepatocytes in the shell. And here we have doped more or less the hydrogel with matrigel just to provide a biologically more supporting material for the hepatocytes. This is first separate printing of the two cell types, and then visualization with MTT staining. So you see here the Hep2G hepatocytes. This is just a section, so we are looking onto one of these core shell strands, and we nicely see the hepatocytes only in the shell region, not in the core region. Whereas just the other way around, fibroblasts, again visualized with MTT, only present in the core. But here in this example, we have printed the two cell types separately. But of course, we can combine that nicely. So here you can see with two different stainings. We have pre-stained the fibroblasts, which a non-toxic fluorescent dye, and have used a calcein staining then for the hepatocytes, and you nicely can see the two cell types in quite clearly distinguishable manner in the two different compartments of this 3D printed core shell scaffold. The PhD student Rania Abdel Gaber from Egypt already did a really big set of experiments, both on effects of the supporting fibroblasts and on different bioink compositions, for example, the effects of this magnet shield, but also of human blood plasma on functionality of human hepatocytes. And yeah, so we are hoping to be able to finalize the respective manuscript very soon, and hopefully you then will be able to find the published paper. Will not show more details about this still unpublished study so far. Yeah, end of that second part will be some insights about the quite hot topic. Can we print, will we be able once to print really functional transplantable human organs? I'm quite sure you all have seen sketches like that, or photo-like images like those here, which yeah, already have this as a topic, and at least the one on the right side looks as if this machine might be able to print a functional or at least functional looking like human heart. So last year I was in holiday on Easter time in Rome. Then the I don't remember whether it was ZDF or ARD, so the German TV channel, sent an email. There is a new study about world's first bioprinting of a human heart. Would this be something for the German evening news? And I was in holiday, not looking up every novel paper, so I needed to find it in the internet, and then could answer, no, this is nothing for the German evening news. It's a nice paper, but it's definitely not revolutionary. But at that time, it really went through the media and also the non-scientific media. Yeah, so I decided to look deeper into that study, just for discussing the topic how far we are concerning printing really functional human tissues. The real paper behind that is not bad. It's quite clear. The authors just describe what they have done. They are not writing. They have printed a functional human heart. They are writing very openly. They have printed a miniaturized model of a human heart. And then the non-scientific media, maybe supported a bit by the scientists, I don't know, yeah, blew it up to this big news. But we, of course, will look into the scientific study. So what they have done was quite clever. They have used tissue sample from a human donor, have extracted the extracellular matrix for development of a bioink. So they have made a personalized bioink, because this material, of course, at the end for a real clinical application could be taken from the patient who should receive that bioprinted tissue at the end. And then they have taken fibroblasts, have redifferentiated them using this induced pluripotent stem cell technology to give, on the one hand side, cardiac myocytes, so muscle-like cells, and on the other side, endothelial cells. Combining this with a hydrogel, they have created two different types of bioink and have used now those for, on the one hand side, printing of a cardiac patch, and on the other side, printing a heart-like structure, but miniaturized in the size of a mouse heart, not a human heart. And in the study also this arrow is dotted, so the authors knew very well we are still not so far that this is something one can implant. Yeah, some images. This was the layout, simplified heart structure, and for this heart muscle patch, which could be of use, for example, after infarction of a part of the heart muscle for a regenerative therapy. So starting with a flat muscle patch, what they have done here is using these two different types of bioink with cardiac muscle cells and endothelial cells, respectively. They have printed this simplified vessel-like structure, which is, if you look closely on this, of course, not a functional vascular system. We will have an extra slide on this at the end of this part, surrounded more or less by this muscle cell bioink. They have utilized, if I remember this correctly, something which can be seen as an intermediate between drop on demand, so more inkjet-like, and extrusion bioprinting. So they have, of course, as mentioned, already printed bioinks, so cells suspended in these extracellular matrix-like bioink, but in a drop-by-drop fashion. So it's a more or less combination, and they could show clearly that they could place the endothelial cells in the regions which are defined here as the walls of these vessel-like structures, and in all other volumes they have the muscle cells, and also the endothelial cells behave like they should and express the typical markers. What they then did was to test the functionality of the muscle cells, and this by imaging fluorescence video micrograph here of the calcium flux. And they could show, okay, the cells are communicating with each other. You can see nicely these waves of calcium ion flux in and out the cells. But what you also can see that there is very little macroscopical movement. Why is that? Because the hydrogel, the bioink they have used, obviously is so stiff that the cells are not able to really deform that. Is that novel? No, it is not. Of course, other labs have published many years before on utilizing human-induced pluripotent stem cells, differentiating those towards cardiac muscle-like cells, which then spontaneously start to beat. And as this is a pure, more or less 2D cell culture model, you nicely can see that the cells here are able to contract this cell layer as they are not embedded in the stiff hydrogel, which was necessary for the bioprinting to be able to create this hollow channel-like structure to prevent that this is collapsing. Therefore, not bad, but it is not really functional. We don't see a really contraction of this printed patch. So moving forward to the miniaturized heart model, here we have the problem that the heart is a hollow structure. It's like a hollow ball with quite thin muscle layers on the surface, which means if you would print that just on air, in air, the structure would collapse. So what they need to do here is to print in a stabilizing liquid, and they have done so. They have printed in a suspension of microparticles, which then after stabilization of the bioink can be dissolved, wash away, so that you then, but after stabilization, so that there is no risk anymore that your hollow structure is collapsing, the structure can be isolated. Again, this is a time-lapse video of the printing process, and you see here this long needle coming from the printer, and of course two different bioinks as before, here visualized with colors. Red, again, the heart muscle cells, blue are no, I stopped it. Blue are the endothelial cells. Is this novel? No, of course it's not. Many of you will know the papers from Adam Feinberg's lab from the United States. He created this fresh technology, and as I've mentioned before, the US colleagues like to print their university logo. So did they here. So again, of course, time lapse, they printed in gelatin, I think, microparticles, and I can show it again, which stabilized the bioink, and after cross-linking step, they just dissolved these microparticles, I think, by slightly warming up. Gelatin is dissolved, and then they can release the structure. So again, not novel what they have done with the heart model, but clever utilize this technology which already have been developed before. Is this functional? No, not at all, because the blood vessels are either leaking or have dead ends. So this is just a model to show, okay, we can combine two different bioinks in the morphology of the biggest vessels this miniaturized heart has, and that's all. The distance between this vessel-like structure and this heart cell is so big that there is no oxygen supply at all from this vessel-like structure to the heart muscle region, which would be necessary, of course, to get any functionality. What we also can see is that for the heart printing, they obviously need to use an even stiffer bioink. So you even can see these drop-like structures remaining from the drop-on-demand bioprinting process itself, which prevents a correct spreading of the cells. So the cells are captured in these bubble-like, ball-like, droplet-like bioink spheres, and even are not able to generate their natural cell morphology. Therefore, not functional at all. At least one slide to this fundamental problem of vascularization, which is probably the most critical bottleneck for printing of really functional tissues, not speaking about organs. What we would need is something hierarchical with an artery-like hollow tube, which can be microsurgically connected to an artery of our body. Then a hierarchical blood vessel-like structure, which infiltrates the whole printed tissue, which is passing a region which consists of very thin capillary-like channels. And then the same again on the opposite, on the venous side, again ending up with a macroscopic hollow tube, which can be microsurgically connected to the existing blood system of the patient. Why we need these capillaries? The capillaries between the arterial and the venous system with diameters of a few micrometers only, so that really the single blood cells just can squeeze through. We need that to keep the arterial blood pressure. If we just would connect a big vein to a big artery, this is like a, oh, I'm missing the English term, only 2 hours of sleep last night, as mentioned before the lecture started. Like if you connect the plus and the minus pole of an electric conduit, that's not working, that's not healthy for your heart. You should not do it at all. Thanks. And therefore, we definitely need that architecture with the capillary in between the arterial and the venous system. And this is something we are not able to print in the moment, at least not covered with endothelial cells, which also are, of course, necessary to prevent clogging of the blood. There are many studies, nice papers from other labs, Jordan Miller, Jennifer Lewis labs, and so on, who really published great work on blood vessel-like structures, partly bioprinted, partly printed, and then cell-seeded, but they are far away from something which can be implanted into a living organism. So to briefly summarize the study about this miniaturized human heart model, they have combined in a clever manner already existing technologies like using PS cells from human donor cells, differentiating those to the cells one would need to create a functional tissue. They have created bioink taking human tissue, so ECM-like, and they also use this fresh-like technology for printing the hollow heart-like structure without collapsing. But they only could do this because they dramatically miniaturized the size of the heart to that of a mouse heart. They simplified the printing dramatically by using only 2 cell types. You will know that blood vessels consist of 3 cell types, not only of endothelial cells. I have shown you that the cardiomyocytes were not functional. There was no coordinated beating. They even were not able to elongate in the heart model. And this vascular system they have provided here is far away from any functionality, even could not be perfused because there was no real second end for connection to a perfusion system. Yeah, therefore, unfortunately, even it was a big media hype, this study was not a big step forward towards the bioprinting of really clinically applicable human tissues. And at least for my understanding, I will not see a bioprinted human organ like liver, like heart, like kidney, which can be transplanted to a human patient. But we probably will see simpler tissues, maybe even such a heart muscle patch, cartilage tissue, skin for sure, maybe the first tissue, which will be bioprinted for clinical use, but not such a complex and also very volumetric tissue, which would be needed to replace a functional human organ. Summary of the second part, which probably also will be the last part because I'm badly out of time schedule. I have shown you a number of strategies for bioprinting of volumetric constructs. Of course, not all really could be used for medical applications, thinking about this quite stiff PCL framework. I don't want to have this in my body in a soft tissue in environment. I have shown you some examples from our lab about bioprinting of different cell types. With extrusion printing, it's very simple to combine either different cell types or bioinks and completely different materials like this self-setting calcium phosphate cements. Yeah, and at the end, outlook for functional tissues, organs, and take-home message. One of the bottlenecks for sure is to bioprint a really functional vascular system, which is not so simple as many people think, just to have a tube-like structure. It really needs to mimic the hierarchical architecture of our natural blood system. That